Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm Maria McCulley, Director of Libraries. Welcome to the 48th Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day Commemoration.
And welcome. I am Assistant Director Felicia Harris. And at the Cambridge Public Library, we embrace Dr. King's vision for America. We strive to uphold this vision through our programs, events, partnerships, and collaborations in pursuit of a Cambridge where everyone has equitable opportunities to learn, live their best lives, and democracy thrives.
Dr. King said in his I Have a Dream speech on August 28, 1963, "Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. We are compelled to reflect on and ask you to reflect on how we center social justice and anti-racism to be at the corner of what we do, who we serve, how we do it, and why we do our work."
We want to thank Muna Kangson and the communications team, as well as Abby Klinger at Central Square for their part in coordinating this program. We would also like to thank you, City View 22 and CCTV for this recording.
It is our pleasure to welcome Mayor Simple Siddiqui, City Manager Ian Huang, and City Councilor E. Denise Simmons, whose offices collaborated on tonight's program. I also want to thank our sponsors, the Cambridge Trust Charitable Foundation and the Cambridge Public Library Foundation. Many of these foundation members are here tonight.
We are also pleased to announce that tomorrow, January 20th, the Central Square Branch Library will unveil its new Black Voices collection. This is a culmination of work between the community and library staff that encompasses a new collection of books, movies, and music from multiple genres, showcasing the Black experience through Black authors, musicians, and other creators. You are welcome to add your own children's and adult suggestions to a developing collection by way of the library website.
The flow of tonight's program is as follows. Mayor Siddiqui will deliver welcome remarks. Singer-songwriter Naomi Westover will lead us in the first stanza of Lift Every Voice and Sing. Councilor Simmons will read and present a proclamation to Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed, who will speak thereafter. Our community partner, Porter Square Books, is supporting this evening's program with book sales. And please do support Porter Square Books and our featured author by purchasing a book tonight. We will close with a group sing of We Shall Overcome. We'll do the first two stanzas of We Shall Overcome. It is now our great pleasure to invite the Honorable Simple Siddiqui to speak. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 48th Annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day event on behalf of the city. Thank you so much to the team at the Cambridge Public Library for hosting this event and for your critical work to provide educational opportunities for Cambridge residents. The library has sustained this program over 48 years, and I'm so grateful to the communications team for putting this event together. I want to also acknowledge the elected leaders, the additional elected leaders we have today. We have Member Hunter from the school committee. We have, yes. We have Member Fantini as well, who's joined. I know that our superintendent, Dr. Greer, is joining. We have State Rep Owens, who is joining as well. We also have members of the Family Policy Council here. including our executive director, Nancy Tauber, and many of the other members who are here. So very glad to have everyone here. This event has been virtual for the last 2 years, and I'm happy that we're back in person. The library has never ceased to provide this amazing opportunity for our community to come together and reaffirm our commitment to Dr. King's values and vision for society. On Monday, I had the opportunity to speak at the annual MLK commemoration hosted by the Peace Commission. I shared that MLK Day comes in the midst of a tragedy in our community, the police shooting of Syed Arif Faisal, a 20-year-old young man. This has been a tragic loss that's particularly painful for our Bengali community. I also shared how Dr. King helped to change the landscape of our country because he lived life with this infinite belief that change is possible. I realized that it was his hope that has inspired so many of us to continue his legacy today. While I'm glad that we've made so much progress on parts of Dr. King's agenda, I also know that we have to focus on a lot of the work that still needs to be done. We cannot celebrate Dr. King's fight for civil rights without mentioning the themes of economic and social justice, which betray his message. We must honor Dr. King's legacy with a continual demand for justice and a persistent push for the progressive policies that he sought. Although the steps towards continuing Dr. King's dream and his legacy are difficult, we have to commit ourselves and recommit ourselves to so many more of his foundational beliefs, including nonviolence and justice. I look forward to hearing from our esteemed author. I look really forward to hearing from my colleague, former mayor and councillor Denise Simmons, to read and present a really, really important proclamation under her leadership in honor of our author and the theme today. So I'm really looking forward to the program. I'm really pleased to welcome you at this event, and it's a true honor to be part of it. So thank you so much for having me.
Good evening. Great evening. And it is a great evening because we're here not only to hear a formidable and wonderful speaker, but to participate and celebrate and remember the work of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. How many of you had the opportunity to see the Embrace or go to the opening? Lucky people, lucky people. You know, when I first saw it, the Embrace, I didn't quite understand. But when I sat there and I listened, it really came home to me, particularly when you think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife, the Embrace. One of the things we always know about him is he embraced the idea of freedom. He embraced the idea of justice, and he embraced the idea of liberty. And what we do here today is we're practicing that spirit. We're embracing those ideals of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As the mayor said, we've been doing this program for about 40 years. But many of you may not know that 4 black women, sort of jump-started this sort of private partnership, public-private partnership. Gloria Vitez, Zelma O. Evelyn, Donna Lassiter, and Kathleen Walcott. And we just lost Kathleen Walcott. Kathleen lived well into her 90s. We should all hope to live as well and as long as she did. But they embraced the idea of making sure that the history of African Americans, black people in this community would not be forgotten or erased. So we're here to celebrate and to remember. So one of the practices of our city council is that when we have a distinguished guest in our midst, we try to mark that occasion with a proclamation. And I'm going to read that and then present it to our guest speaker. I cannot say how thankful that you came, that how many people I browbeat into reading your book. I said, you have to read this book. And they did, and we all enjoyed it. Some of us listened to it, I think, what did you say, Estelle? Was it a podcast or something like that? Audiobook. I'm in love with audiobooks. You get in your car and just zone out. So let me read it, and it reads as follows. Whereas Pulitzer Prize winner, author, and distinguished professor at Harvard University, Annette Gordon-Reed, shall be reading from her latest book on Juneteenth at the Cambridge Public Library on January 19, 2023, as the keynote speaker during the city's annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day Observance. And whereas Annette Gordon-Reed is an accomplished scholar who has made significant contributions to the fields of American history and legal history. And whereas Annette Gordon-Reed is the author of several notable books, including The Hemmings of Monticello, An American Family. I just want you to know I listened to that on books on tape when I was driving back from Philadelphia. My wife wasn't very happy. She wanted to listen to jazz, which was the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2009, and Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, which has been highly and widely praised for its thorough and nuanced examination of the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, a woman who was among many of the slaves he owned. And whereas Annette Gordon-Reed's latest book on Juneteenth is a timely exploration of the descendant-long effort to have Juneteenth recognized as a federal holiday, which was finally realized when President Joseph Biden signed into law June 2021, an event which Annette Gordon-Reed was a special invited guest of the president. And whereas the City Council wishes to extend its gratitude and appreciation to Annette Gordon-Reed for her continuing contributions to the field of history, scholarship, and for agreeing to serve as the keynote speaker at this year's observances of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Now, therefore, be it proclaimed that the Honorable Councilor E. Denise Simmons, on behalf of the entire City Council, formally go on record in thanking Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed for participating in the city's 2023 observances of the annual Martin Luther King Day with the public reading from her latest acclaimed book on Juneteenth at the Cambridge Public Library.
Thank you very much for coming out tonight, and thank you for that wonderful proclamation. I was a little surprised by that, but it's great to have. It's always good to be in public libraries. I grew up in my hometown in Conroe, Texas, going to the Montgomery County Public Library whenever I could, and to the library in my school whenever I could. And it's interesting, I live just a block away from here, over on Harvard Street, and I've never been here before, but I will have to, it's been years now, I keep thinking of this as a high school. That's the one next door. But I'm glad to be here, and I will certainly be back now that I realize how close I am to it. I'm also happy to be able to be a part of a Martin Luther King celebration. This is something that I'm so happy that the country recognized that, his birthday, as a thing for us to commemorate. And it's something that I think gives us an opportunity to carry his message forward and to think about what he's meant to the country, a person who didn't live very, very long, but accomplished very much in his life. It would have been almost impossible to have imagined over the course of Martin Luther King Jr.'s short life and career that he would be celebrated in the way that he is celebrated today. Not when he was the seminarian preparing for the ministry, not when he was the young minister and pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, not when he started his career as a civil rights leader, rising to the status of martyr after his assassination in 1968. Now that the United States has made his birthday a national holiday, celebrating it for several decades now, King has become a more acceptable figure than he ever was in life. Liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, all claim him, using his words to justify their sometimes contrasting visions of the world. It may be hard for people of a certain age to remember, and for younger people who came of age with books and school projects celebrating King to imagine, but he was considered an extremely dangerous man by many in the United States. A threat to domestic order and a threat to the foreign policy of the country. Newspapers inveighed against him, as did politicians. Throughout his career as a civil rights leader, he regularly faced death threats. Once, while giving a speech, he was subjected to a politically motivated assault. And on another occasion, he was stabbed by a mentally disturbed woman. The threat of violence was never very far away from him. The threats did not just come from ordinary citizens. Very famously, the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, used the power of that organization, or one could say abused the power of that organization, to subject King to intense surveillance, following him, tape recording him in hotel rooms. At one point, FBI agents tried to push the civil rights leader to commit suicide by threatening to reveal embarrassing information they had learned during their nonstop investigation of him. It was not only government who had concerns about King as a political figure. And make no mistake, King was a political figure. What he was arguing for would require actions in the political sphere. Members of the public at large were also skeptical of him. His base was, of course, among blacks, many in the South, but African Americans in general were by no means uniform in support of his tactics during the 1950s and the 1960s. Certainly, a clear majority of white people saw him as a thoroughly problematic figure, a dangerous radical who was needlessly stirring up hostility between the races. Even whites who supported him thought sometimes that he was pushing too far, too fast. As for King's crowning moment, giving his signature "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial during the 1963 March on Washington, polls show that a large majority of Americans disapproved of that now iconic event. One of the most interesting things about history, or studying history, is seeing how attitudes about events, people, works of art change over time. Many people hated the Eiffel Tower when it was built in the late 19th century. Now it's the world-recognized symbol of France. Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial was reviled and is now one of the most admired monuments in the nation's capital. And we can wonder if the Embrace will suffer a similar fate or history as it goes on. The march has now entered American history as a high point in the American March of Progress, a thing that was almost foreordained to happen. The speech King gave that day created the indelible image of the man. The words about having a dream that blacks and whites could live in harmony, and that one day his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. That part of the speech, about the color of the skin and the content of the character, is now the most often quoted passage. These stirring words have been heard and used in different ways by people as the years have gone by. As always, it's important to remember that when King spoke those words, he did so in a particular historical context. He was speaking in a world shaped not only by the legacies of slavery, but a world shaped by the continued legalized segregation and widespread voter suppression in the South. By almost any measure, Black Americans were second-class citizens in the United States. Although he did not use the phrase, King's words amounted to a strong rebuke of the concept of white supremacy, which was endemic to the world as it existed in 1963. From the beginning of their time on the North American continent, Black people were explicitly judged by their skin color. Slavery in the United States had been racially based. In the slaveholding South, Blackness created the presumption of enslaved status. Free Blacks in the South and in the North were treated as second-class citizens. The content of their character, in King's formulation, made no difference whatsoever to their status in the country. So King's statement about the dream for his children, for all children really, was a direct challenge to a basic idea that had animated American life from the very beginning. The idea that whiteness conferred a benefit and that Blackness conferred a penalty. This had to be rejected, King was saying. The implications of King's words were far-reaching, requiring more, perhaps, than even the staunchest allies of Blacks were prepared to accept at the time. That part of this dream, coupled with King's invocation of the Declaration of Independence as America's creed, with its language about equality, called for a radical change in American attitudes about race. Again, context is important. Americans hearing that message were doing so at a critical time, not just in terms of domestic policy, but in terms of foreign policy. The United States was in the midst of a Cold War with the Soviet Union and China. Americans were telling developing nations, countries that had recently come out of colonialism, or who were angling to do so, that our way of life was better than the path offered by the regimes that had purported to take up communism. King's challenge, therefore, had not only domestic but international implications. As King well understood, he knew this. His words, spoken at that critical juncture, painted a devastating picture of a country that was not, in fact, what it purported to be. What did Jim Crow say to the world about the true nature of American values? What did the fact that many Blacks could not vote say about the nature of American democracy? Well, we know what happened. A number of forces, marches, protests, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, hastened the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, legislation that ended de jure Jim Crow in the United States. The assassinations of King and Robert F. Kennedy cemented in the minds of many the need to support the kinds of things that both men were said to stand for. People spoke of King's dream as a thing to be realized, though it quickly became clear that doing away with laws would not be enough to ensure the kind of transformation that King sought. It is important to note, particularly given where we are now, that not everyone was on board with the idea of transforming American society along the lines of King's dream. Many of the people who opposed him during his lifetime did not give up on their opposition in the face of the legislative victories that he, his supporters, and other champions of civil rights won during the 1960s. In fact, the triumphs of the civil rights era almost immediately brought a backlash from mild to extreme. After the end of de jure segregation, it quickly became apparent that more than just removing laws was needed. If there was going to be real change in American society, steps had to be taken to dismantle structures that continue to promote white supremacy without explicitly doing so. Companies and other entities began to take steps to combat prejudices that had been baked into their operations over decades, if not centuries. They started to make extra efforts to recruit Black students and employees. The name that was given to this process, of course, was affirmative action, designed to help transform workplaces and university campuses. Now, this was from the beginning controversial in some quarters. Not everyone was happy with this effort, with this turn of events, and indeed, the backlash against these efforts began very soon after these policies emerged, but reached fever pitch during the 1980s. Opponents of affirmative action and other measures designed to write a different story of race in the United States hit upon King's language about judging people not on the color of their skin, but upon the content of their character as a way to attack affirmative action. They insisted that what King had been arguing for all along in this speech was a colorblind society. Any measures that took race into account amounted to the kind of racial discrimination that King supposedly was criticizing in his speech. People who would have opposed King, and actually did oppose King, cast themselves as the true defenders of King's legacy in order to work against measures that had been adopted to try to bring King's vision into fruition. In the process, King's image has been transformed so that even the most conservative members of American society, though not the most reactionary and racist members who continue to hate him, or openly, claim to be admirers of King. The King who was, in their view, a person who adhered to the notion of a colorblind society, defined in a way that would outlaw affirmative action and other measures designed to take into account racial identity. I've written in another context that King now fits so comfortably into the present-day popular understanding of American history that one might think that nearly all Americans supported him enthusiastically from the very start, and that his murder was a tragic event unmoored from any other wider opposition to his activities. He is safe in a way that he never was when he was alive and in the public eye. He is useful to conservatives and liberals alike. Liberals who do not really want too drastic or abrupt changes in the status quo can focus on the idea of a hazy dream that doesn't require immediate and concerted actions. And as noted, conservatives can use King to say that so-called colorblindness is a way out of America's racial problems. They also avoid being considered racist by claiming to admire a Black man. In an important way, Malcolm X, who was painted as King's opposite while they were both alive and on the public stage, has helped create the current image of King. Malcolm, who started out as part of the Nation of Islam, was seen as even more militant than King. He appeared as a scary alternative to King. Malcolm did not talk much about love or peace. In fact, as the historian Peniel Joseph has shown in his book, The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the two men moved toward one another over the course of the years. Malcolm understanding that Black people needed some white allies, and King understanding that more aggressive measures might be needed in order to bring about real change in the United States. But the notion of King as a safer or safe alternative to Malcolm X has persisted in the minds of many. The people who really knew King and had been paying attention to all that he said and did have long been concerned about the way he has been turned into a safe, if not even cuddly, figure. First, activists and now scholars have sought to set the record straight. In recent years, they've made the point that focusing on the language of his speech during the March on Washington, as if that were the only things King ever said, minimizes the depth and the breadth of what King was attempting to do during his time as a leader. I would say it's worse than that. It trivializes King. He developed a strong critique of American society based upon his own personal experiences, those of his family and community, and from his study of history and philosophy. Scholars Tommy Shelby and Brandon M. Terry have insisted that we pay greater attention to King's actual philosophy. They write, despite King's having been memorialized so widely and quoted so frequently, serious study and criticism of his writings, speeches, and sermons remain remarkably marginal and underdeveloped within philosophy, political theory, and the history of political thought. King, they say, was a public philosopher, though he was unrecognized by academic philosophers. His philosophy was much deeper and extensive than is generally acknowledged. Take economics. From the very beginning, King understood that the transformation of American society would necessarily involve more than just promoting civil rights. It was also imperative to bring about economic transformation in this country. As a young man, he described himself as leaning toward socialism. So he was never averse to the idea of using government to effectuate economic planning to improve the lives of poor people, both black and white. Ending de jure segregation was never King's only plan of action for this country. He understood that once the laws mandating segregation were destroyed, concerted efforts had to be made to ensure that the equality he championed would be a reality in America. The conservative plan of pretending to ignore race, not to see it at all, had no place in King's philosophy. Race-conscious programs were needed. On several occasions, King specifically endorsed the idea of, quote, compensatory treatment, unquote, for black people. Anyone who read and considered history would understand that American society had actively worked against the interests of African Americans, first in slavery and then in the long aftermath of the institution. As a group, they were held back on the basis of their race, he wrote, quote, a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something for the Negro, close quote. He also wrote that, quote, whenever the issue of compensatory treatment for the Negro is raised, some of our friends recoil in horror. The Negro should be granted equality, they agree, but he should ask nothing more. On the surface, this appears reasonable, but it is not realistic, close quote. He was writing these words before affirmative action became a widely spread and recognized policy. But this language, as well as other King's writings, put the lie to the idea that he would have thought that the current day version of colorblindness was against his philosophy. He totally believed that action, affirmative action, some types of affirmative action were needed. But King's radicalism went beyond championing mild forms of affirmative action, which really is more reformist than radical. Anyway, during the latter part of his life, he turned his attention to economic justice in terms that sound almost like a call for reparations. Quote, "Can any fair-minded citizen deny that the Negro has been deprived? Few people reflect that for 2 centuries, the Negro was enslaved and robbed of any wage potential, accrued wealth, which would have been the legacy of his descendants. All of America's wealth today could not adequately compensate its Negroes for his centuries of exploitation and humiliation. It is an economic fact that a program such as I propose would certainly cost far less than any computation of 2 centuries of unpaid wages plus accumulated interest. In any case, I do not intend that this program of economic aid should apply only to the Negro. It should benefit the disadvantaged of all races." Now, he was talking here about a jobs program that he had formulated that would take aim at poverty in America, which he knew would lift not just Black people, but would lift many whites as well. His critique of the Vietnam War, which infuriated people, even people who had been his supporters, not only took in the problem of violence in the world, he noted how much money was spent in that effort instead of strengthening the social safety net in the United States. And this is something that many people thought was unforgivable, because many Democrats actually had been supporting the war, and they thought his criticism was out of line, and he was stepping out of his lane and doing some things, talking about things that he should not have been discussing. But he saw a direct connection between money spent for the military, for those kinds of adventures, and the lack of funding for poor people in the United States. With the battle against de jure segregation won, King turned his attention to economic development, supporting the idea of a poor people's campaign, where the idea is that they would gather together and they would all assemble and go to Washington, and it would have the same kind of effect for poverty that the March on Washington had done for the Civil Rights Movement. He was in Memphis in April of 1968 in support of striking sanitation workers when he was felled by an assassin's bullet. I was a kid in the 1960s. I don't have much personal memories of King as a living person on the stage of history. Also, my family, and my parents, I would say, kids follow along with their parents mainly when they're little, leaned much more towards Malcolm X than Martin Luther King. Though both of my parents did admire him, I think particularly for my father, King's religiosity was something of a turnoff. So that aspect of King was not something that he adhered to. But as I said, they did admire him, but much more Malcolm X and that wing of Black activism at that time. I do know exactly where I was when it was announced that he'd been murdered. I was at the home of a neighbor with my mother, and we, at least the women at least, were in the kitchen making tamales. I recall the neighbor's son walking into the kitchen at one point and said, "Well, they killed King." Now, even if I wasn't following King as a public figure, I knew immediately who he was talking about. I also stuck on his phrase, they killed King. And I assumed that he meant white people, particularly white people who had been opposed to King and what he was trying to do. White people specifically, as I said, those who were opposed to King, not all white people. But that use of that term was, I think, important because he saw himself and saw us as beleaguered people who had had a leader who had been taken from us. And he said it with such resignation, as if this were something that were inevitable. Of course this is going to happen. He would be taken away from us, that he would be struck down. So what do we make of King today. What do I make of King today, and where we should go with this? I join the call of people who say we should take a deeper look at King, something beyond just the repetition of the speech, the I Have a Dream speech that will appear every year around this time, the clip, and to realize that this was a person who thought long and hard and deeply about American society and formed a critique that is valuable to us today, that is relevant to us today. And we should, I also think, rescue him from people who would use his words cynically as a means of standing in the way of all that he worked so hard to achieve, that he gave his life essentially to achieve, to bring to fruition in the United States. I often hear the phrase, if King were here, ... and people would say he would think this or that and the other, and I typically disagree with whatever they add to the end of all of that, particularly when it's about color blindness and affirmative action, all those kinds of things, as I mentioned before. I often disagree with those pronouncements. But I have my own thoughts about that, and they are based on his lifelong struggle for the triumph of the idea of equality and his belief that government, which is supposed to be us after all, it's supposed to be the people, that the government has a role to play in eradicating poverty and mitigating income inequality. The ideas and statement in King's speeches and his writings indicate to me that he would be all over this question of income inequality and would understand exactly how corrosive it was and what it was doing to our society and why we should be working on that particular problem. He would also be for the marginalized in society. The brilliance of having the King holiday, in part, is that it gives us time to pause and reflect over what his legacy is and what we think it should be. You always wonder about holidays in America because they all start out with the highest ideals, even Juneteenth, and then it becomes, a mattress sale and car sales and all kinds of things, because it's America and we're going to sell things. But this is a moment, I think, for us to pause and think about what he actually said and to sort of read. He wrote books. There are other writings besides the I Have a Dream speech. And there was a reason he was seen as dangerous, not just because he was trying to bring people together, but because he understood that to effectuate the things that he thought were important for America, America would have to change. People would have to give up ideas about white supremacy. People would have to be willing to share. People would have to give up militarism just for the sake of it, and that poverty was something that we should work on and try to eradicate. So I'm happy that there's a holiday, even though, as I say, I worry about how it's actually used, but it is an opportunity for gatherings like this and in other places for people to say that he was much bigger than that one speech. There was a reason he was considered a dangerous man, and he gave his life to try to make this country better than it was when he was born, and the world that he grew up in. He wanted it transformed for people who came after him, and I think we're all the better for his having lived. Thank you.